Do you believe that there are enough rehabilitation systems in place for helping homeless people in Melbourne?
I don't think there's enough support in place, no. So when you use the term sort of rehabilitation, there's lots of different forms of support that exist.
Yep.
I mean, if we just use Front Yard Youth Services as an example, this is a place where young people come to get assistance with the full range of their issues. So not just their housing, but they'll come here to see a nurse, they'll come here to see a lawyer, they'll come here to see a family support worker, they'll come here to see, a Centrelink worker because they've got no income, they'll come here to talk to someone about trying to get back into school. So when we talk sort of support or rehabilitation, what we're talking about is lots of different forms of support that are about trying to get someone on the right track that's going to lead them away from homelessness. That support exists, but there's not a lot of funding for it.
Yeah.
So even like Front Yard is the main service in Victoria that helps young people who are homeless, and yet we really struggle for funding. And so that can be frustrating when you know that a certain response would be really useful for a young person. So for example, today there will be lots of young people who will come in and will have absolutely nowhere to stay tonight. The best we can offer someone who once we determine cannot safely be at home is what we call a youth refuge. And a youth refuge is basically a sort of a house, so just think of a suburban house where maybe 6 or 8 young people will live on site. There'll be workers on site 24 hours a day. They'll stay there for about 6 weeks. And during that 6 weeks, they get given lots of support so that hopefully at the end of that 6 weeks they can either reconnect with family or perhaps have to look independently for accommodation. That's the best case scenario. And yet, in this state, there are only 15 youth refuges. And that gives us a total of 109 beds.
Yeah.
And they're not 109 beds that become available every day, because today there may only be 3 beds available.
Yeah.
When someone gets one of those beds, they're going to sleep in it for the next 6 weeks. So that means today there'll be lots of young people who will turn up, who will say, I've got nowhere to stay, and there will not be a safe option for them. So they'll get offered, to be honest, horrible options. Some of the options are things like maybe they'll have to look at staying in a rooming house. And I'm not talking, nice, pleasant rooming houses. These can be, very unpleasant. They can be dangerous. You can be surrounded by, much older people who are, may have got out of prison last week, or may have serious addictions, and they can be really horrible places to stay. So when we talk about is there enough support, there's support, but there's probably not quite enough of it, and it doesn't extend for a long period of time, which is what most people need support with. Yeah. So it's a long-winded answer, but it's a complicated issue.
Next one. For pedestrians that are walking past a homeless person, do you have any advice for them? Like, what should people do in this situation?
I tend to think the most useful thing you can do is actually just smile at someone. Just be pleasant. We often hear people talk about feeling invisible, that if they're on the streets, nobody gives a shit about them. Like, that's how they feel, like nobody cares. And they do feel like everyone looks through them, which is interesting if you haven't been in the city for any longer. I don't know if you've come across the big issue.
The homeless people that sell them on the street.
So they're people who are either at risk or homeless, and they're doing a legitimate job. It's a good magazine and everything. But it's always interesting to stand back, maybe stand on another corner, and watch how people interact or don't interact with them. Everyone suddenly develops a keen interest in their phone, or on the ground, or in the sky, or at their watch. Like, you just so few people actually bother, even if they're not going to buy a magazine. I buy the magazine, but you can't buy it from everyone you see. It's really nice to just be pleasant. You go,
Yeah.
hey, you don't have to give someone money. You don't have to do any of that. You can just be pleasant to someone. That can make a difference.
Yeah. And then, what field of work do you specialise in that can go towards helping the homeless people?
So at Front Yard we do a little bit of everything. It is primarily crisis intervention. So we do tend to see people when they are smack bang in the middle of a crisis and everything's fallen apart. We are very holistic in our support, so we kind of recognise it doesn't solve the problem if you just focus on trying to put a roof over someone's head. You've got to figure out what led them to be homeless in the first place, because there's always reasons, and unless you address those underlying reasons, then you're probably not going to help someone move forward. So here we look at their health, we look at, do they have any legal issues? We look at what's the family situation. We look at what their independent living skills are. We look a lot at the amount of trauma that they're having to deal with.
Yeah.
So we have a lot of therapeutic programs, things like on the other side of that wall, we have a music therapy room, which is incredibly popular with young people and incredibly useful, and perhaps some young people who haven't responded to counselling will respond amazingly well to our music therapist. So, we have pet therapy and all sorts of stuff, and it's about recognising this person's going through a lot of trauma. Let's start dealing with that trauma. Let's try to get them to a point where they feel safe and welcomed, and at that point they'll start opening up about what's really going on in their life. So we do a bit of everything, and I think it takes a bit of everything. There's no one single solution.
Read your questions.
Yeah.
What are usually the profiles of homeless people that your organisation comes across?
Well, for us, obviously, it's young people. It's actually quite difficult to just say, this is the typical story you're going to see, because everyone's story is unique. The one thing that the majority do have in common, and this is the number one cause of youth homelessness, it's family breakdown. So most of our young people, unfortunately, have experienced family violence. Sometimes that can be really extreme, to the point where they may have been removed from family and perhaps grown up in state care. Or it may be that there's just an enormous amount of conflict and arguments at home. So that is one really common experience for our young people. It's family breakdown. Yeah. So it all kind of stems from that.
In what way does your organisation attempt in getting the homeless people back on their feet?
Well, we do it in lots of different ways. We definitely do it through sort of therapeutic interventions. We definitely do it through trying to give people independent living skills. So out here behind me, we've got things like a kitchen where young people will learn to cook. If you're going to live independently and you haven't got mum or dad who can cook up a meal, you're going to have to figure out how to do that yourself. And how to do so on a really tight budget. They're practical skills that most of us get to learn really slowly over time. We don't just suddenly get booted out of home and are expected to be able to look after ourselves. So we focus a lot on independent living skills, and they're really useful because you can take those skills with you throughout the rest of your life. So we do that. We have a big focus on getting back into education. Lots of our guys have had to drop out really early. Hard to be homeless and be still in education. So we have a classroom on the top level of this building that does VCAL, and it's really flexible learning. So even when someone perhaps is struggling with lots of significant issues, they can still at the same time work towards getting their education. So we have a focus on a lot of different things, but we understand that it takes that sort of focus to help move someone forward. It's not just put a roof over someone's head.
What is the most common misconception about homeless people?
There's a few. I'd say first off is that I think people are surprised at how many young people are homeless. I think nationwide it's about 44,000.
Wow.
And they're just the they're the official figures. And I'm sure lots of people didn't get counted in
Yeah.
those. And even those figures are from the last census data, which is about 7 years ago, I think.
Wow.
So it was wrong back then.
I can only imagine it now.
It would be massive, but 44,000 young people, and I think the stereotype of someone who's experiencing homelessness is still middle-aged guys who might be sleeping rough. So I think that's a stereotype, and I think the fact that when people think of someone being homeless, they do think only of those who were sleeping on the street, who were sleeping rough, and that actually makes up only 5% of the homeless population. So the other 95% are doing things like couch surfing. They might be staying in those really dodgy rooming houses. They're staying in places where there's no safety, there's no security, and it's not ongoing. So there's different definitions of homelessness.
Yeah.
And how does your company fund your expenses?
Yeah, so probably about maybe 70% of Front Yard is government funded. So it's kind of a combination of federal, state,
Yeah.
local government. And then the other 30%, to be honest, you try to make up with donations and, philanthropics and corporate partnerships. You never get, if you need this much funding from government, you will never ever get it.
Yeah.
If you're lucky, you might get that much. So
Yeah.
then you've got to figure out how do you make up the rest of that. So it's a bit of a patchwork quilt, but we even have behind you there. There's a list of particular schools that come in and learn about homelessness and then go away and decide, well, we want to make a difference. So they'll raise a little bit of money that might make it possible perhaps for us to run a cooking program or to fund a music therapist. So it's hard. I'm sure it's the same
Yeah.
for any non-profit. It's hard to get enough funding.
Yeah. Is there one specific place which is on the streets that is known for the homeless to stay?
Probably the most well-known is Enterprise Park,
Yeah.
which is beside the aquarium, just on the corner here. Last week was pretty clean and deserted, which was good to see. I haven't seen that for a very long time. But that's really, if you Google Enterprise Park, you'll come up with an awful lot of stuff. It's where lots of people do sleep rough, and it is where an older gentleman who slept rough for a very, very long time, who was a lovely, lovely guy, over 2 years ago lost his life because somebody repeatedly stabbed and killed him while he was sleeping. It's a very exposed area. If you walk past it, you just see it's completely exposed. So if somebody did approach you at night, you really have no protection.
Yeah.
So that's probably one of the most notable. The other places, maybe places like Swanston Street at night, people will perhaps choose a spot like that because it's quite lit up, so that makes them feel like it might offer some safety. It's very, very dangerous sleeping rough. It's not. I sometimes think people think we exaggerate when we say that, and it's not an exaggeration. We hear horrible stories of young people being assaulted, and most young people, if they have to sleep rough, will try very hard to find hidden spots.
Yeah.
Sometimes there's spots not far from here that I sometimes show groups, and they're just such odd spots that you would never ever think someone would be spending their night there, and yet young people will go that extra mile just to find a spot that's really hard to detect.
Yeah.
If you could give the world a message in advertising or showcasing the topic further so that more people are aware, what would that one message be?
Oh, boil it down to one message. I think if I had to boil it down, I wish that people knew that it was in our best interest as a community to do something, to want to do something about the issue. Even if you're someone who looks at the world purely from a financial point of view, if you just look at it in terms of money, we would save enormous amounts of money if we invested in people early on when they first become homeless, so that we don't have to later on be paying for them to be in and out of hospitals and in and out of emergency rooms and in and out of prisons, which is what can happen to people in the end. We would save money. As a community, we would save money, but we tend not to make that investment. So I wish people would realise that we'd all benefit if we put the effort in early.
Yeah. What is one thing that others could do to like help out these situations?
Yeah, look, I think there's probably a couple. I often think of it as so there's two different sort of streams. One, I think, is about raising awareness. I always say that to students when you go back to your own school. I know everyone always thinks that homelessness doesn't affect them, and yet almost every school that I deal with, perhaps not in front of students, but teachers will quietly take them inside and go, yeah, at the moment I've got about 20 young people who, you know, they're sort of floating in and out of homelessness, they're couch surfing. I think even within your own school community, you can do an enormous amount by just letting young people know that if they're doing something like couch surfing, if they're having to crash at a friend's place because things are not great at home, that's a form of homelessness, and they can reach out for help at that early stage. And if they do, you can prevent someone getting to a point where their circumstances are so desperate that they've run out of couch surfing options. And we see that all the time.
Yeah.
It doesn't always start out as sort of an awful, horrible situation, but it often progresses to that. So I think that in terms of raising awareness, that's just important to know that that's actually a form of homelessness.
Yeah.
And the other thing is, sometimes people don't want to hear this, but what makes a difference is money. You know, I mean, you guys are obviously not from this state, but there will be services near you that I'm sure are doing really great work that would really benefit from even just the tiniest donation. So sometimes if you have something simple like a sausage sizzle or something, you might not think that $200 is a big deal, but $200 might mean that for a particular day you can run a program. So sometimes sometimes little things can make a difference.
Yeah, like last night we went to a what was it?
Soup van and help the homeless
soup
people.
vans, and we were giving out like socks and stuff like that to help out all the homeless people and that.
Yeah, I mean, and that's and it's also I think important to also keep in mind that it's more than just. I think when people think about like donations or whatever, they think food and they think clothes. Some of the stuff they don't think about are things like, we see this all the time at Freya. Something as simple as a young person not having any proof of ID. It's hard to explain how difficult it is to survive if you don't have a piece of paper to say you exist.
Yeah.
And what we spend a ridiculous amount of money on is trying to get a copy of someone's birth certificate, which I think has a cost attached to it, and I think it's $31. It is a piece of paper that proves that someone exists, and therefore they might have a better chance of getting housing. They might have a better chance of getting an income. They might have a better chance of getting into a course. There's lots of stuff you can't do if you don't have proof of ID. And yet most of our guys can't afford that $31. So that cost falls to a service to have to cover. Now that's not something someone can donate, it's not like asking for toothpaste, but that one piece of paper can open up possibilities for a young person.
Yeah.
So I always try to get that through to people that, food is obviously important and clothes are important, but sometimes it's the stuff that's not so obvious that can actually make the world of difference for someone.
People in the street that we've asked say that most homeless out there are influenced by like drugs. What is your opinion on this?
Well, I do think there is a bit of a misunderstanding of the role that drugs might play in someone's life. We see lots of young people who have been dealing with what we call complex trauma, and that does mean that usually very early on in their lives they have been abused by the very people who are meant to look after them. So they carry around an enormous amount of trauma. That, in many cases, will lead to them developing mental health problems. If you try to imagine yourself as someone who's got no family support, you suddenly have nowhere to live, you're really struggling mentally, you're struggling to get through the day, your mind is full of all these awful thoughts and feelings, and you think you're worthless, that you've been told you're worthless your whole life, that's what you think about yourself. It is really, really easy to reach a point where you think, you know what I want to do? I just want to drink myself silly and drown out those thoughts. We see lots of young people like that. So the addiction can often be at the very end of that process. And I think sometimes when they think of homelessness as just being about addiction, they do it in a way that's really dismissive of people. They don't take time to think about why is it that someone's engaging in that sort of behaviour. It's usually not because, gee, they're just out for a good time and got nothing better to do. It's usually some sort of coping mechanism. It's not a good one, and it leads to other problems, but it is part of a coping mechanism for them. So I wish people had a better understanding of trauma and the role that it plays in homelessness, because I think if you walked around the city, if you saw someone who was even 40, 50, I would be willing to place money on the fact that their issues go all the way back to
when they were
trauma
little.
early on.
Yeah.
I would put money on it. And yet, I think as a community, we're sometimes just very dismissive of, if we see someone sleeping rough, we make certain assumptions about them. We usually base those assumptions on our own life experience, and by goodness, my life experience just doesn't even remotely resemble the young people I work with. So, if I'd gone through what they've gone through, would I feel like at the end of the day drinking myself silly? I probably would. So I kind of wish that people just had maybe a little bit more understanding of the role that trauma plays. And if you just Google trauma and homelessness, you come up with an awful lot of stuff. So it does play a big role.
Yeah, well, yeah.
They were very thorough questions.